I suspect I've probably travelled the longest distance of any delegate here today, but fascinatingly, when you start to look at the strategic challenges being faced by my country, by Australia, in the Indo Pacific, and you take a look at the context and the strategic disruption here in Europe, there are all sorts of resonances, and I want to explore some of those today. So please just begin. I have no slides, so please just begin by imagining the world map upside down, as it should be, with Australia and New Zealand near the top, and just start thinking a little bit about how the security environment is seen by a country like Australia. I'm going to talk about two things in the next few minutes. I'm going to talk about the contest for dominance, really, and influence in the Indo-Pacific region. But I'm also then going to talk a little bit about the Australian way of responding to that. And a big part of that story is the AUKUS technology sharing arrangement, which we all know about, but I think few of us really understand. And so I want to dwell on that a little bit, and then come back at the end to questions about, actually about deterrence, really, and how do we achieve deterrence in the Indo-Pacific without destabilization, deterrence without escalation. So to begin with, just a few framing thoughts about my region, about the Indo-Pacific, which is now a concept and a term that's become quite orthodox in understanding international affairs, but until a few years ago it was really something of an academic curiosity. We were talking about Asia or the Asia-Pacific. I know I've probably got a few British colleagues in the room who still use the term Far East. Please don't do that. It's the Indo-Pacific, and it's quite a serious point, because if you start reframing the Asia-centric maritime region as the Indo-Pacific, you start looking at its global connectivity. You start looking at a part of the world that is the centre of gravity in terms of economic growth and dynamism, certainly central in terms of demographics, at least until perhaps in the second half of the century we see Africa take its place ahead of Asia. But the Indo-Pacific is also, of course, a place of great strategic rivalry and pressure, and much of that is really centred on the way that China has used its rising power and the unsettling effects that's had on the interests, the stability and the values of others in the region. And there is, of course, a thread that connects that very clearly to the shock and disruption that we've witnessed here in Europe with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, because the No Limits partnership between the leadership of Russia and China as of just the eve of the invasion of Ukraine confirmed, I think, for many of us that there really is one evolving strategic theatre of contest. But a few more thoughts about the challenge we face in the Indo-Pacific. I think a lot of the popular narrative about the security tensions in my region really go back to the relationship between the United States and China, and a popular narrative is to say this is all about the United States seeking to retain primacy in a region where it's had strategic primacy for decades, and a rising power, China, seeking to displace the United States, as if that's the natural order of things, that the rising power displaces a declining power. And that narrative completely excludes the interests and the agency of actually most of the region, because Asia is much bigger than China, and the Indo-Pacific, although it's an Asia-centric region, actually engages global stakeholders. So Europe, for example, has very serious economic stakes and indeed normative stakes in the outcomes of what happens in the Indo-Pacific. So if you put aside for a moment the theory that this is all about US-China rivalry and it's actually about something else, then you look a little bit more at China itself and what China is seeking to achieve in the Indo-Pacific region. So think of a region that really spans the two oceans, the Pacific and the Indian Ocean, that is defined by the growing connectivity between those regions, the flows of trade, of energy, of people, of information, of finance, of investment. That reflects in many ways China's own expanding interests. You know, the so-called maritime Silk Road, part of the Belt and Road, is really in many ways China's version of the Indo-Pacific, extending influence through geoeconomic connections all the way to Africa and beyond. And if you look at the region in that way, then in fact there are many players at work. India, a rising power, Japan, and we'll hear more about that shortly, a very substantial and significant power, a democracy in the Indo Pacific that in many ways is becoming a more effective strategic actor and using the idea of the Indo Pacific to build coalitions to protect its interests and to limit Chinese power. The Republic of Korea, the new Korean administration, I think is being much more outward-looking in building its security partnerships as a democracy. Southeast Asian countries, and I think Philippines, for example, re-engaging closely with the United States at the moment. And then, of course, the question of Taiwan, and Taiwan is actually one of the most sophisticated democracies in the Indo-Pacific and a vital part of the regional and indeed global economic order. So in this mental map, what's Australia doing and why is Australia seeking to really strengthen its own security capabilities? If we look at an Indo-Pacific region where China is pursuing some form of dominance, and I think there's plenty of debate as to whether there's some sort of plan or vision to be the dominant power in the region or whether this is really an extension of the authoritarian control and the need to assert Chinese power and Chinese nationalism to cement that control domestically. In some ways, it almost doesn't matter whether there is a plan, because in my view, what we're seeing from China in the Indo-Pacific is a kind of colonialism on speed, if you like. In many ways, the flag's following trade. There is understandable economic and diaspora connections across the region. That's fine, but there's also a security footprint that's following that. We're seeing that in Australia's neighbourhood in the South Pacific at the moment. And the effects are effectively the same. The effects are destabilising, unsettling for the interests and values of many other societies and countries. And this does lead to frictions, it does lead to disruption, it does lead to flashpoints, to risks of conflict. And so although I suspect when we get to a conversation, the future of Taiwan is front of mind when we're looking at flashpoints in the Indo-Pacific, and there are plenty of understandable questions and much scrutiny about whether the invasion of Ukraine is going to hasten or delay the day that the leadership of China decides to take reckless action against Taiwan. Taiwan is not the only place of friction in the Indo-Pacific. The South China Sea, the East China Sea, the China-India relationship, and that broader horizon of risk where China's interests are expanding and a security footprint is following the economic footprint. All of this creates a potential for confrontation between powerful states, which is why, incidentally, the Biden administration's policy of competitive coexistence is actually a sensible setting and probably about the best that we can hope for to achieve deterrence without destabilisation in the Indo-Pacific. So what's Australia doing? The conversations I've had here already, just in one evening here in Sweden, and earlier this week I was in Finland engaging with the think tank and official community there, are really illuminating for me, because there's a fascinating parallel between Australia's decision to pursue a nuclear-powered submarine capability under the AUKUS agreement with the United States and the United Kingdom, and the pursuit of NATO membership by Sweden and Finland. Both challenge fundamental assumptions about strategic alignment that we've assumed for many years, or assumptions about the public and political appetite for change and really a hardening in security posture. Because in Australia's case, a country which has traditionally been very allergic politically to all things nuclear, and where in many ways we have developed military capabilities and security capabilities that are not commensurate with our extraordinarily large geography, this is really a sea change. The pursuit of a nuclear-powered submarine capability would give Australia the ability to deter and monitor across a much larger maritime space in line with Australia's extraordinary Indo-Pacific geography. And it reflects an Australian commitment as well to collective security in the region. So in fact, one of the great diplomatic challenges that my colleagues in the Australian government, the Foreign Ministry, are pursuing now is to ensure that the region and regional partners understand that a stronger Australia is actually in their interests as well. And there's a very substantial Chinese disinformation campaign to undermine that view. But the pursuit of that technology sharing arrangement with Britain and America is not the only thing Australia's doing. And I should note, of course, that AUKUS is not only about submarines, it's also about really trust and sharing in critical security technologies in a way that can in time be extended to additional partners, including here in Europe, based on capability, trust and wider engagement. But the Australian reality check on security goes much broader than the military dimension. The contest for influence in our region is a military contest, reflected particularly in China's military modernisation and the expansion of its navy, of its blue water power projection capability. But there's also a contest for influence through geoeconomics, through investment and infrastructure and trade and development in ways where China is seeking to gain strategic advantage and in some ways, in some cases, capture of local elites as well. For Australia, one of the big wake-ups actually was clearly reported campaigns of political influence and indeed interference around 2016, 2017, and a very strong national response to that through legislation to restrict foreign political interference, which of course didn't particularly make Beijing happy. The momentous decision from Australia to exclude non-trusted vendors from 5G networks, Huawei and ZTE, was another big step in that journey to really hardening the national security infrastructure of Australia, but doing it in ways that reflected the will and the culture of a democratic society. What we've seen recently is an adjustment to that view, and I think when we get to a conversation about stabilisation, about how to ensure deterrence without disruption or destabilisation, the Australian experience is quite instructive, because what we now have in Australia, a relatively new Labor government in the past 12 months, its rhetoric is softer, it's more disciplined, if you like, with regard to China. It's trying to, if you like, stabilise that bilateral relationship. But the national security settings have not changed. And the very fact that under a Labor government in Australia, there is continuity in the AUKUS nuclear submarine program is really an extraordinary thing. It builds largely a consensus. I mean, there are some parts of the Australian political debate that will still challenge this, but at least at a leadership level, there is largely a consensus across the spectrum on this. And you have, in many ways, to use the famous, the famous metaphor, a country that is speaking softly but building, if not yet carrying, a big stick, which is a pretty nice definition of diplomacy. So where do we go from here? As I said, I think there is a full spectrum contest for influence in the Indo Pacific. It is very much about an authoritarian Chinese state that, as yet, has not tested really the limits of its power in the region, is using risk as a form of leverage, so risk in the way that its maritime forces behave in contested zones like the South China Sea, but at the same time, an increasing amount of solidarity and pushback from a wider range of partners. And the very fact that we've seen European policy settings on China change in recent years towards that de-risking ethos, I think, is a really welcome development there. We will face flashpoints and risk in the Indo-Pacific for many years to come. So for those of you who are perhaps more from the private sector than from the academic or policy communities, I think thinking about the Indo-Pacific in terms of risk and thinking about China in terms of risk is not only a healthy starting point, it's the only starting point. And that's, of course, quite a change from the world of 5, 10, 15 years ago. The connection between the Indo-Pacific and the European theatres is going to remain. And if anything, I think as we see European partners become more interested and invested in stability in the Indo Pacific, there'll also be a greater expectation of countries like Australia, Japan and others to really play their part in supporting stability, sovereignty, frankly, a rules-based order in this region. And so on that note, it's going to be fascinating to watch shortly when I anticipate the Australian Prime Minister will be at the Vilnius NATO summit, and let's hope there is some substantial new Australian commitments there to the defence of Ukraine. I'll stop on that note and I look forward to the conversation.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Rory, did you drop something on the floor?
Yes.
Yes. What can be said about the bilateral relations between China and Australia? Have they been affected by the establishment of AUKUS?
So there's been a very difficult bilateral relationship between Australia and China for many years now. It really goes back, I'd say, to around 2017 when Australia began to introduce protective measures against Chinese influence in Australia. So in that sense, AUKUS hasn't fundamentally changed the relationship. It has added to what was already a difficult relationship. Having said that, the real low point, if you like, in Australia-China relations was when the Chinese government chose to take extraordinary offence several years ago when an Australian government had the temerity to suggest that there should be an inquiry into the origins of the pandemic. And the way that was handled diplomatically by Australia was somewhat awkward, but China's extreme overreaction to that decision, which involved effectively trade sanctions against Australia, that really was the low point in the relationship, a sort of a suspension of dialogue. So fascinatingly, although AUKUS is well and truly underway now, the Chinese government has chosen to look for, if you like, face-saving ways to maintain or rebuild some dialogue in the relationship, and that's in Australia's interest too. So although China is waging a very strong disinformation campaign against AUKUS in the region, in fact, bilateral dialogue is beginning to come back to some kind of predictable, stable footing. And that, to my mind, is a signal that it's pretty good to stick to your guns, so to speak, if you're standing up for your national interests. Sooner or later, even great powers have to talk. Thank you very much, Elsa. Thank you.